to this Sussex Writes special lecture on John Keats. And we're beginning today with an introduction to Romanticism. What I'm going to offer today is a little overview of the long 18th century and the Romantics and why they're important, and finish up with just a little indication of how Keats is a radical and exciting poet to be studying. So welcome to this mini lecture, and my name is Dr. Emma Newport. I'm from the University of Sussex, and I represent an organisation called Sussex Writes, which is all about sharing a passion for literature, a passion for writing, and today, a passion for Keats. So, as I say, this is what we're covering. The long 18th century, an introduction to it. What were the big things that were going on? Who were the Romantics? Why were they important? And finishing up with a bit of an introduction to Keats, the radical. So, where to begin? Well, the 18th century is one of enormous change. And by a change, I mean radical social and economic change. It's what could be considered the dawn of the modern era, although the early modernists among us who study Shakespeare's time would maybe disagree with me on that. But we do count it as the dawning of the modern era. And it's at this time that we witness the rise of liberalism, of associated ideas of religious freedom, intellectual freedom, the principle of toleration, of a system of rights and responsibilities between individual citizen and the state that originated in the work of philosophers like John Locke and became more certain in the creation of, for example, the American Constitution. We also see through this time an emerging doctrine of capitalism and global free trade, the first moves towards industrialization, the establishment of international trading ports in Canton and Calcutta, the European discovery of Australasia. And because of all of this, the 18th century, which we call the long 18th century because we kind of stretch it out until the arrival of Victoria on the throne in 1837. So although you are studying the early 19th century, if you're studying Keats, really we capture him in this thing we call the long 18th century. So because of all of these discoveries, these moves towards constitutionalism, these moves towards more liberal and tolerant politics, the 18th century has been called the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, which is actually a term coined by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And it kind of speaks to the idea of the scientific discoveries of Boyle and Hooke and Newton, this world in which we have the explorers, James Cook and Joseph Banks. We've got the expansion of medical knowledge with the first medical degrees being awarded at Edinburgh in 1696, and in 1751, a revolutionary medical school being established by Dr. Cullen. We've got a printing revolution with the freeing of the press in Britain and falling printing costs, leading to a vigorous and invigorating expansion of literary markets, and most importantly, a massive spike in literacy rates. And so we're sometimes invited to assume Romanticism kind of is born out of a response to Enlightenment. Enlightenment giving us rational measuring of the world, scientific discovery, and Romanticism is often seen as a reaction against this of Enlightenment and empiricism. The famous poet Anna Letitia Barbauld said, "Few can reason, but all can feel." And I refer here to Rousseau, who is up on your screen right now, as a kind of counterpoint to all of this kind of excitement, all of this flourishing of Enlightenment ideals, of liberty, of reason, of rationalism. There is this awareness, this growing awareness of all the ways in which man is constrained, and I use man to encompass everybody. That's a term that was being used in the 18th century, although we might have problems with it now. In the 18th century, man is used to represent everybody, although we would probably contest that. We would probably say that when they talk about man, they're talking about a particular kind of elite male figure. But people like Rousseau are raising these important observations of the ways in which society and its politics constrain us, restrict us. Not only this, but running counterpoint to this narrative of progress, enrichment, and discovery that I've just set out, scientific discovery, the expansion of global markets and free trade and all of these things, we must always remember that much of the wealth built in the 18th century derives from the enslavement and transportation of men, women, and children, and that it is built out of another world in which there is destitution, extreme poverty, and that these rights that are freely discussed only pertaining to an elite consisting of white upper class property owning men. The 18th century closed with Europe in turmoil in the wake of the French Revolution. This really sits across the Romantic era as we understand it. So we enter a protracted series of battles that were imagined rather reductively as French tyranny versus British liberty. And that too is a gross oversimplification that ignores the brutal social, political, and economic consequences of a divided Europe. The French Revolution began as a call to liberty, as a desire to overthrow an absolute monarchy that was tyrannical, and yet what ultimately ended up replacing that oppressive and repressive institution really manifested the same problems of surveillance, torture, imprisonment. The great hope of the French Revolution disintegrated into a bloody finale, and what replaced it with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, at least from the British perspective, was a new French tyranny. So the end of the 18th century into the early 19th century, which is right when John Keats is writing, we have a divided Europe where we have a protracted series of wars. We have a climate crisis that led to a year with no summer in 1816, and with it, famine and riots across Western Europe. All of this sitting across an era that is supposed to be called the period of Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment era. So this is the world into which Keats is entering as a young man, and this is what he is responding to. We might ask ourselves then, what is happening to poetry in this period?